They are seldom discussed. Yet the men and women of mission control had the crucial task of guiding the entire journey of astronauts, from liftoff to their return to Earth. Today, we delve into the extraordinary paths of these exceptional controllers. In the second half of the 1950s, the development of ballistic missiles and future space launches was accelerating both in the United States and the Soviet Union. When the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 into orbit on October 4, 1957, America was astonished and terrified.
In 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, it was a big shock to all of us.
This is the Cold War, so...
I never thought much about it. And I'm sure a lot of people felt the same way. They said, oh, okay, so. But the politicians thought something about it. They saw those big Russian rockets carrying bombs and coming over to the United States. So the politics were very, very much involved in that.
The war was getting intense globally.
So I was working at McDonnell Aircraft as a design engineer on the Phantom II, the F-4D. At that time, you know, when I heard that, I said, well, hey, we need to get back in space to America, put America in the forefront, which I knew we couldn't do that.
This is followed by a rivalry for satellite launches. The Soviets send the first living being into orbit, Laika, and the United States send Explorer 1 in turn. Tension reaches its peak as both the Soviets and Americans compete to launch a human into space first. On the Soviet side, the R-7 Semyorka missile, designed by Sergei Korolev, is transformed into a crewed capsule launcher. And on the American side, they choose the Redstone missile, designed by the renowned Wernher von Braun. It's a somewhat parallel choice, since both missiles were previously used to launch the first satellites of the two nations, namely Sputnik 1 and Explorer 1. To control the flight from the ground, mission control is established at Cape Canaveral, Florida. In this small building, everything needs to be invented from scratch.
In the Mercury days, it was short flights compared to today, but critical flights because they were new and never experienced before. I had to know the network. This is the era before satellites, so I had to interface with the tracking stations around the world. And so I had to know tracking and telemetry and how they interfaced with the control center.
At that time, it is a certain Chris Kraft who takes charge of mission control. Christopher Kraft is recruited as the very first flight director of NASA. He has the incredible responsibility of assembling and leading a team of engineers and inventing all the procedures that will allow for flight control. What makes him strong is his ability to create a sense of cohesion within mission control.
Chris Kraft was our #1 flight director. He was the older guy in the control center. He's like 35. That's the old man, sort of, for a young 20-year-old. You know. But so he was God. His influence on all of us was very strong, and he had a unique mannerism about him, very calm, cool, collected, but a presence that was very powerful.
And he was our super boss, and he's probably the guy we feared the most, that if we didn't satisfy his wishes, he would fire us. He was very autocratic. And but he was the first. He was the guy that created everything we ever did.
My first experience with Chris was on a simulation, and I walked into that control room and I thought, my gosh, now I'm with him. I'm in the same room with him. And I still feel that way a little bit about him, although over the years we became more good friends than anything else. But Chris still has an aura about him that is unique. I had heard that he had eyes like a laser, and sure enough he did.
He had a thing where if he disagreed with you, or became annoyed with you, he would say something and then say, I can't do anything about that, young man. When he called you young man, your career was finished. And he called me young man one time, and luckily I escaped. As time went by, I appreciated more and more his status as a leader, as a originator of the things we did in flight operations. So, and the respect.
So, yeah, he was definitely in charge.
Some of us feared him.
We all loved him. He was a great man.
You learned a lot from him.
Oh, yeah.
Around him, men gather, whose names and reputation will become part of history. Among them is Gene Kranz. This former fighter pilot and flight test engineer joins NASA, like Chris Kraft, at the very beginning of the Mercury project, as Chris Kraft's direct assistant.
At that time, Gene was a 28-year-old fighter pilot from Korean War, and so they sent me down the hall, and there's Gene Kranz, and I became part of his flight control section. And so I was mentored with Gene Kranz, who was really like my older brother. Spent many years with him. I sat to his left in mission control. So whenever you see him, I'm probably over to the left.
On April 12, 1961, the world learns that a Soviet has just reached space. His name, Yuri Gagarin. In the United States, the same shock overwhelms the Americans, and among them, those who were working to send Shepard first.
You know, we didn't really have that much interest at that point, but my interest started after that.
So it was a big shock.
And I think the nation reacted with a resolve to do something about the technological differences that existed then.
I think it was a great accomplishment, but that kind of gave us another feeling that we needed to accelerate our program and try to get an American in space early. And I think that was probably the start of the space race.
We knew we had our work ahead of us, for sure.
But we also wanted to maintain safety, crew safety, mission success, things like that. And so we didn't take that out of our mind. But it gave us more of a feeling to accomplish something for America.
So the race was on.
It's only a few weeks later, with this renewed motivation, that Alan Shepard prepares to become the first American in space. On May 5th, 1961, as he sits in his capsule waiting for liftoff, something specific happens that wasn't anticipated during the rehearsals. Shepard needs to urinate. True, with a 15-minute flight, one might think it was unnecessary to plan for such a scenario. But what wasn't foreseen was the prolonged wait due to delays before liftoff. And during all this time, Shepard can't exit to relieve himself. He's been strapped in for 8 hours, and the urge becomes pressing. Unable to hold it any longer, he ends up urinating in his suit, causing the liquid to short-circuit some medical tracking sensors. Since human spaceflight is completely unknown for Americans at the time, the concern about the liquid inside the suit is even stronger. Ultimately, the flight is a success, and it's a triumph for Chris Kraft's teams. Despite the accomplishment by the mission control team, Alan Shepard and his Redstone only completed a suborbital flight. In order to match the Russians, the Mercury program evolves toward a more powerful rocket, also based on a missile, the Atlas. For this first flight, astronaut John Glenn takes the lead. Glenn's flight is a success, and finally, the Americans are on equal footing with the Soviets. President Kennedy makes the audacious bet of putting Americans on the moon before the end of the decade. Not only to go there, but also to return safely.
And we had a bold president that stepped out and said, let's go to the moon. I wasn't quite to NASA yet, but I can remember thinking, can we do that in a decade? I wasn't sure we could.
However, it's not with a single-person orbital capsule and a few hours in space that such an ambitious goal can be achieved. NASA then concludes the Mercury program, and the next project, Gemini, begins. From now on, mission control is somewhat divided. From the start of the countdown until the rocket clears the launch tower, control is operated from the Kennedy Space Center. When the rocket is above the launch tower and when radio announces "Clear the tower," the brand new control center in Houston takes over until the mission's end, which is the capsule's splashdown. Gemini allows for the technical validation of all procedures that will be required to move on to the actual lunar program. Astronauts and controllers experience extended stays, spacewalks, work inside and outside the capsule, as well as rendezvous and docking with other spacecraft. Except for a few hiccups in Gemini 8 and 9, the program is a great success and instills strong confidence in NASA for the future. The logical next step is, of course, the Apollo program. The program tragically begins for the controllers when, during a flight rehearsal in January 1967, a fire breaks out in the Apollo 1 capsule. The three astronauts, Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee, perish in the fire. It's a shock for all of America, and this tragic accident shapes mission control.
And then the Apollo 1 fire happened in January of 67, and at that point, we didn't fly for a while. During that off period, I was made a flight director, which meant I would be a flight director then for all of the subsequent Apollo missions.
For Gene Kranz, the controllers must also take ownership of their responsibilities. From then on, he instills two words that will become the guiding principles of mission control: tough and competent. Tough means being conscious here, signifying that the controllers are aware of their responsibilities in each of their actions. And competent is a way of urging each controller to strive for perfection in carrying out their tasks. Gene Kranz adds that these two words will forever serve as a way to remember the three men they lost that day and to ensure it never happens again.
So what does a flight director do in Apollo? An Apollo flight director is like conductor of a symphony. You have to make sure the final sound comes out okay, but you don't play an instrument anymore. And that's the way I felt. I felt that I had to make sure that the whole team was pulled together and that it was going to fall on me ultimately to make the final go, no-go decisions that we would have to make. And so it was a team effort, and quite often the astronauts and mission control get a lot of the credit, and we deserve our share of it, but it was a huge team that you didn't see on television and in later film. It was a team that was very well suited to react. We had support from all over the country, and so they would jump in and help when we had a problem. So it was a very, very unique setting, and I think it paid off for us. It worked.
The role of a flight controller is an immense personal sacrifice.
You know, when we started the Apollo program, the average age was in the mid-20s. I first came to work there when I was 23 years old.
So we had a lot of very young, aggressive, positive thinking people.
We really did feel special.
For us, yeah.
Well, we acted special. You know, as you act when you're in college, you think you're special and you go out drinking beer. But we really thought we were special.
There are a couple of reactions that the public had of mission control is that we were kind of all stamped out of the same mold and came from similar backgrounds and that kind of thing, which was not the case at all. We came from all over the United States and a few from foreign countries that had become citizens. And we were different, but when we got into that inside the control room, we thought together. It was very much togetherness.
It was quiet. Normally it was very quiet because we were always talking on the intercom loops. And if you were just standing there, you wouldn't hear anything as a observer.
Everybody smoked cigarettes, cigars, or pipes. It was a feeling of getting the job done. Once we had a crew in orbit, we would always focus on our job to make sure the crew safety.
We had fun too.
Yeah.
You know, we had to release the pressure sometimes. So we had fun.
We went, after work, we were all team members. We went out and drank beer. We had our favorite places to drink, and we did. We drank a lot of it. It was very collegial. We were all young, you know. We were all under 30 years old. I was 30. And we would go gather up at our meeting place was the Singing Wheel. Singing Wheel. It was a restaurant, bar, and we would go there and throw money on the table, make a pile of bills, and buy pitchers of beer. And marriages really didn't suffer well during those days because we were hot shots. We were going to the moon. We were going to, you know, and families suffered because of that. We were always in the control center. If we weren't in there doing testing late at night, we were drinking beer late at night. There's no excuse for that, but we did.
The life with our kids was kind of truncated and small. I'm sorry I missed that, but you know, the kids turned out just fine. That probably had a lot to do with our wife of 61 years, who pretty well took care of them. And but they actually both turned out to be great citizens, and I think most of the kids of people in Mission Control did well. Our kids played together. They were friends with the astronauts' kids, and I really do think that team and that team effort was the difference.
We worked hard, we played hard, but we always kept in mind that it was, like I said, crew safety, vehicle safety, mission success. And the best part was always getting the crew to land back in the water safely on Apollo and getting them back on the ground on a runway safely in shuttle.
An honor to be there at that time. Yep, I would have to say my favorite job was being a flight director in Mission Control.
Cy Liebegott leaves Mission Control after the Skylab and Apollo-Soyuz missions. He then goes on to work on astronaut training at the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, the training pool for ISS astronauts. Today, he gives talks about his NASA experience. Dutch von Ehrenfried assists during the Apollo program with suit preparation, testing them in a vacuum chamber and aboard zero-G aircraft. He is the author of 5 books about his experience as a pilot, mission controller, and also about potential future Martian missions. After Mission Control, Jerry Griffin takes on more administrative roles at NASA. He becomes the deputy director of the Edwards Test Center, then the Kennedy Space Center, before becoming the director of the Johnson Space Center in Houston. He later works in the private sector. He appears in nearly a dozen documentaries about Apollo and even serves as a technical consultant on the movies Apollo 13, Contact, Deep Impact, and Apollo 18. He also appears as a flight controller in Contact. Lastly, Bill Moon continues to serve as a controller for the Apollo-Soyuz missions, Skylab, shuttle missions, and the International Space Station. He has been enjoying a well-deserved retirement since then. After the Apollo program, the Houston Mission Control Center will continue to oversee the entire American crewed space program up to the present day. The consoles from the Apollo era are no longer there, but the current control center, named in honor of Chris Kraft, manages activities on the International Space Station and might handle lunar missions of the future. One thing is certain. Even though today's attire is sometimes more casual, teams are much more diverse, and smoking is prohibited, the spirit of Mission Control endures, tough and competent. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, feel free to show your appreciation with a thumbs up. For the most generous among you, you can support me with a small donation on Patreon or Ko-fi. The link is in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode about Mission Control, an episode that was made possible by the availability of Cy, Bill, Dutch, and Jerry, thanks to the support of the Cité de l'Espace. As for us, we'll see you next time for a new episode of Stardust. See ya!